My name is Rachel Bruce. I'm the visiting assistant professor in illustration here at Webster University in the Department of Art Design and Art History. Many of you know me, but if you don't, hello. First of all, I'd like to thank the Speakers Committee for their continued support of the Artist Lecture Series. And I'd like to thank all of you for spending your time here on this Friday before fall break talking about art and learning about art. That's really awesome. Thank you so much for being here. So, D.B. Dowd is a writer, illustrator, and scholar who writes on the hybridity of reading and seeing, the history of illustration, and practices of drawing. He will publish Reading Pictures, A History of Illustration with Princeton University Press in the fall of 2025. His book, A is for Autocrat, a Trumpian Alphabet Illustrated, was honored with local, regional, and national ADDY, American Advertising Awards, in 2021. Dowd also publishes the illustrated journal Spartan Holiday, a nonfiction serial tracking his travels to diverse locations. He teaches at Washington University in the MFA for Illustration and Visual Culture program. Please give a warm welcome to D.B. Dowd.
Well, greetings. How you doing?
Hi.
All right. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I had the great pleasure of working with Rachel at WashU for a few years, and it's a treat to be able to come to where she's teaching and try to say something helpful. So I've had kind of I'm one of those people who never quite figured out what I was. It took me quite a while. So I started as a printmaker. I kind of always drew, and I always wrote somehow. So I stumbled around for a while, but I was an undergraduate history major. Later decided, yeah, I guess I want to get more serious about this art thing. I went to graduate school in printmaking, and I made things that were portfolios of prints that were kind of bookish, including this one, a book called Cry Mustardville, which is a portfolio of prints with a text about a mythical town that basically tears itself apart. And I wrote it, it was sort of during the Rwanda and Sarajevo episode, and so that was informing that. And so I'd make these prints, and I'd, put them in really nice boxes, and I would sell them to art museums, and that was fine, but they take a really long time to make, and they're really expensive. They're a fine thing, and starting in '97, I started doing some work for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I had this kind of running serial, and it was fun working for more public context. And so I began to think, oh, maybe this illustration thing, which I didn't really know much about, frankly, might be worthwhile exploring. Also, I noticed that the people who were in the design department were like happy, and they got along, and their students had work, and it was like, oh, I like this. So I talked my way to the design department as a printmaker, basically, and sort of began osmotically learning about illustration. So this is the kind of thing I do now. This is kind of a travel log that I publish intermittently, and it combines kind of travel writing and the history of the places where I go and kind of the visual culture of those places. This particular episode, this installment was about traveling to Paris, but I grew up in this town that had a French name that everyone mispronounced, and so it was kind of about a meditation on home and away. So, meanwhile, while I was kind of learning about illustration, I ended up kind of backing into a conversation because someone basically called the university and said, hey, my dad, who's gone now, used to be an illustrator, and he was kind of famous and good at it. But his stuff is in my garage, and I'm moving. Could you help me out? And the person in question was Al Parker, who was an extremely accomplished illustrator and kind of a designer of pictures, who the kind of high season of his work was really between 1940 and 1960. And so, because I had done work with the library and I had good relationships with them, I went on the trip to go see this stuff. Like, what is it? And again, because I had kind of come through the side door into illustration through printmaking, I didn't really know that much about the culture of it. So we go out to California to see this garage, which is filled with this beautiful, smart, thoughtful stuff from this like pre-feminist planet. And I just had not seen anything like it, and partially because I was seeing it out of context, right? I'm just seeing these gouache paintings in racks. And then also the business correspondence and the photography and all the stuff that went into this practice, and I was totally fascinated by it. But the biggest, what fascinated me most was, what is this? And how would you think about it? How would you write about it? Like, it's easy to see how it wouldn't count in certain obvious cultural contexts. But it was so witty and intelligent and kind of winsome that it kind of stuck in my craw. And it was very clear to me that it was physically in a garage, but it was also culturally in a garage. Like there was literally nowhere for it to go. And long story short, a couple of us said, yeah, we should take this stuff. We don't have anything like it, but it's really interesting, and this guy's really important, so let's do it. Now, most illustration collections start and stop there. There's some local guy, whatever, with this kind of interesting, weird node of cultural production that exists in isolation. We got lucky, and the phone started to ring. We did a symposium on Parker, and we started hearing about other people who had things in their garages. And so this started in 1999. So 25 years ago, we accepted our first work. Since that time, we've been approached by many people. We've started to buy some things. So we have built this kind of amazing archive of the practice of primarily American illustration from the late 19th century into the 21st. And the pitch I always make to potential donors is, look, you could, I guess you could just sell this stuff off, but it would take you a ton of work and you wouldn't make that much money anyway. And also, then it would all be dispersed and no one would know what it is, and that would be it. Or you could give it to the local place where you live. And that would be fine if they know how to take care of it and if they actually want to take care of it, which is not always the case. Or you could let us take care of it and we will help place your family member in a professional context among their peers where people are interested in these things and study them. So two things happened. We created a library unit. A very generous donor gave the money to endow the collection and for some reason insisted that my name should go on it, which is weird because I'm not dead. So I just kind of, nod and on the one hand, it was probably a good strategy because I'm definitely not going to stop working on that. So, and the other thing is that we started an MFA program in illustration and visual culture so that illustration, as we will soon momentarily discuss, is a field which has been, shall we say, underdeveloped as a serious area of study. Printed matter, which combines words and images and conveys information of some sort. This is the earliest dated book in the world. It's a Buddhist text, printed in Tang Dynasty, China, in the 9th century. This is a book which came out in 2019 on the history of illustration. And this is a book which I asked my graduate students to acquire as a reference work. I had some involvement in this, and I was part of the first conversations about what would it mean to do a project like this, et cetera. And I am good friends with all three editors. So I'm very positively disposed toward this book. And it is a useful book, but it is a big, fat thing. It's very expensive, and it is best for researching nooks and crannies of a practice which is sprawling. One of the challenges of writing about illustration is that because such books are often addressed to people who are in school who maybe want to become illustrators, there is a tendency to be a little squishy about the edges of like what is illustration and what is it not. And I understand why that makes sense in certain contexts. Here, this is from chapter 1 of that book, a piece by Bob Bingerhoff and Margot McElwain in Mishura. To illustrate is to signify and lend clarity to a subject by visual, usually pictorial means. Okay? Does that meet that definition? It's a little difficult for us to know because it requires time travel to symbols which are not legible to us. I mean, they're legible, but we don't know what they mean. This is a series of petroglyphs in southern Utah, right near the entrance to Canyonlands National Park, or an entrance. There are several. Okay, so how this seems hard. This is a Sir Walter Scott novel that I'll spare you the long story. The quick story is he wrote a bunch of novels that were wildly successful under a pseudonym, and he was outed in 1827 as the person who had actually written the novels. He worked for the court system in Edinburgh. And so it became known that he was kind of a famous guy, and it turned out he wrote these novels. And it kind of, the publisher in Edinburgh, Fidel, said, you know what, let's put out a new edition. And this is one of the very first illustrated novels. And what illustrated meant was a frontispiece illustration and a vignette on the title page. That's it. Those two engravings would be printed in this particular set of novels. Over 48 months, they put out one volume every month, and it took 4 years, and all these novels. And there were then a series of publishers who did similar things. So to begin, I started with, okay, what can we say? We can say illustrations are pictorial contributions to reading experiences. Seems kind of plausible. But there are other elements on pages which contribute to either the pleasure or the effectiveness of the reading experience, which aren't strictly pictorial. They might be decorative. There's kind of no reason to exclude those. So, on reflection, I included that. Now, in our collections at WashU, we acquired, 10 years or so ago, the research library and archive of material from a man named Walt Reed. Walt Reed wrote The Illustrator in America and a number of books which are kind of best understood as chronicles of illustration. I would use chronicle over maybe the more stringent word history. But and this is actually his hand-lettered comp for The Illustrator in America, which is pretty cool. So there's his hand lettering. And we've got a series of decades, and then there's a famous illustrator who's going to write the commentary. This is how illustration history has been written. Who was famous or really good at making illustrations in a given decade? That has been most of the books, not all, most of the books have this kind of architecture, which is fine, but it's not necessarily a super helpful way to try to wrap your head around a subject. Who was good at what when? It's not really the same thing. From a very famous lecture by Lord Acton in 1895, one of the pieces of advice he offers to students at Oxford is, if you want to be a historian, you should study problems, not periods. Now, he was talking about, the 17th century or the 18th century. But what he's getting at is, think about a problem, not just what happened at a given interval. R.G. Collingwood, who was a mid-century British historian, who basically paraphrased what I just said of Acton in a piece of writing. He goes on to say, the history of dining is not the history of eating, which is a pretty interesting sentence, because human creatures have been eating things for a long time. I mean, we're all still here. So, but dining is a cultural notion. Humans ate long before they had built a culture of eating. So, implicitly, then, Collingwood helps us ask, it's more than a one-part question. It's not the question of what is illustration, but also when. When is the temporal envelope of what we would call illustration. So coming back to where we started with this working thesis, okay, that's where we left off. Here's where the more worked version of this has ended up. Illustrations, printed by definition, are pictorial and decorative contributors to modern reading experiences published in vernacular languages. Vernacular languages are like French and German and English, as opposed to Church Latin, languages that people speak. And the earliest publishing was not in vernacular languages. So this is the first illustrated Bible, about 30 years after, 20 years after the Gutenberg Bible, which is like 1455, which was not illustrated. This is a rag published briefly in the 1820s that you can think of as sort of like proto-tabloid. These are stories about particularly grisly and satisfying public executions. And so the last moments of Lord Balmerino, like, it goes on for a while. It was a rough go, but it was very interesting to the public. And here we are again at Scott. This is 1829. So we're thinking about reading experiences. Now, we've already thought about this for a second. Is this a reading experience? You could actually, if you tried, argue it's a reading experience. It's just a reading experience that is not accessible to us. I think that's kind of a stretch, but we could do that. But what we need that we don't have is a test. How could I look at a thing and say, okay, is this illustration or is it not? How could I come up with a way to establish where the edges are? And the edges, if you want to think about a thing, what its edges are pretty important. If there really aren't any edges, it's a little squishy. Generally speaking, illustration has been super squishy. This is a famous edition by the illustrator N.C. Wyeth of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, which is written like in 1880. Scribner's puts out this fancy edition in 1911 with Wyeth's illustrations. Wyeth, by the way, along with his teacher Howard Pyle, basically has art directed all the Pirates of the Caribbean movies from Beyond the Grave. So these these illustrations were electric when they appeared in 1911. Part of it is the color is so over the top because he knew to get halfway decent printed color, he'd have to really juice the saturation in the paint. And these paintings, which are all good-sized paintings, like yay big, are in the Brandywine Museum in Chadsford, Pennsylvania, which is worth a visit. So this is a scene where Jim Hawkins, who's the young boy, is the star of the story, is he likes to go down and hang out with the cook. Well, the cook turns out to be Long John Silver, and he leads the mutiny on the boat. And there's a scene where the two of them are down there, and while they're down there, there's this parrot that is constantly shrieking, "Pieces of 8! Pieces of 8!" Which, and the actual painting, they're like these little blobs of paint. There is no parrot there. But when you see the printed illustration, yeah, that's a parrot. So he's yelling pieces of 8. So what are pieces of 8? A term that had entered, pirate movie lingo a long time ago. Pieces of 8 were basically silver dollars that were worth eight reals. And this was basically the currency of the day. So this issued by the Spanish king. So it's kind of gimmicky, but as I was trying to work through this problem, like, okay, what's the test? How can we come up with a way to think about this subject in a more rigorous way? And I came up with 8 words that start with P. You'll have to tell me whether you think that's silly or not. The first one is printed. The reason why printed is important is that it implies more than one. It also is the beginning of the early modern era, which is when more people begin to learn to read. So this is an Albrecht Dürer woodcut. This is an English woodcut circa 1600 about a witch, a broadside announcing a heinous crime. This is a magnified steel engraving from the mid-19th century. And we don't have time to talk about this today, but the process of reproducing images, which went through many phases, reproductive engraving, primarily to reproduce artworks, became a thing in as early as the 17th century. Engraving was practiced in Europe from the 15th century, but it also grew up into kind of an industry. And you can see here this highly rationalized system for building a value structure. This is called the lozenge and dot system. These little negative diamonds with a little dot in the middle. By controlling that, you could get an enormous number of range. And then this is a lithograph from near the turn of the century from a magazine published in Munich called Die Jugend, or The Young. And this is kind of participants in kind of avant-garde print culture of the 1890s. So a lot of different kinds of printed things from different moments, but effectively there's some printed books in China that are designed to be useful like as early as the 14th century. In Europe, it's the 15th, but it is the beginning of modernity. Published. This is an interesting, like if, let's say, I really like to cook, and I compile my recipes and make a little booklet, and I draw some pictures of fish or some other element in my little booklet. We can say that I've participated in illustration as an activity, like I made a thing that would go with reading. But if I don't publish it, it doesn't actually come to the level of being a cultural practice. And there's a reason why publishing is an important threshold. So this is kind of a fake folk practice. So the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company publishes a cookbook that kind of wants to have the sensibility of like, you know, it was like our church cookbook, or, you know, like for lack of a better term, a folk character. This is the National Dairy Council. These are all mid-20th century, and my best meat recipes. So these are all basically advertising publications. They're all kind of doing the same thing. They're useful to the reader if you want to make some meat, for example. And they kind of have this character. They insinuate themselves as if they're a friend made them, but a friend didn't make them. And so in the modern era, illustration is not a folk practice. It's a professional practice. Okay, pictorial. This is more complicated than you think it's going to be. So, one thing from working on this book for me, I've learned the most about the first half of the 19th century. There were these books that were published starting around 1822 in London. A particular publisher, Rudolf Ackermann, who was a transplanted German in London, and kind of had a genius. He was kind of an impresario of print. He adapted a form that existed in both France and Germany. There were like these little pocket books. And he kind of gave it a little extra something and started creating, they were called literary annuals, and they were published at the end of the year, and they were intended to be gift books for women. They were not inexpensive, but they were, you didn't have to be super rich to buy them either. They're affluent. So these little books were filled with short stories and poems and historical accounts, various kinds of textual information. But they also had engravings in them, metal engravings. For those of you who, how many here have taken printmaking? Okay, So you know the difference between intaglio printing and relief printing? Intaglio printing is where the paper is wet, you've got grooves in it, you have to smash the paper down into the grooves and pull it out. Relief, you're just rolling over the surface. Metal engraving is an intaglio process. So it's kind of laborious and it's slower to print than relief. But it also feels really good, right? It has this velvety character, the paper is soft. People loved engravings. So they started publishing, these books had engravings in them. And they started in England, and then they came to the States. They were published in New England. And one of the biggest problems was getting enough engravings. And you know, these little books, they'd go in a woman's bag, and they were like little museums, right? They were beloved. But one of the biggest issues, especially in the States, was getting sufficient engravings. But there's also a problem, which is like, well, what is the picture there for? In point of fact, the picture is there because it makes the book cooler, right? It's not telling you something about a story. It's just a cool picture. But they started to realize this is a little weird, so we need to somehow stitch this together a little bit. So this is a painting from 1831 by Leslie, from a scene from As You Like It. Did anybody see As You Like It this summer? Because it was the St. Louis Shakespeare show. There's a scene where there's a shepherd, and Touchstone is kind of the wise fool character, and Audrey, who's this kind of farm girl. And it's a comic scene. This is that scene. So this is an engraving of that scene. And given the format of the painting and the size of it, the painting was conceived as an image that was gonna have an engraving made of it. So it's in this long horizontal format. And so there's Alexander Lawson makes the engraving of Leslie's painting. And they put it in the Token, which is an American literary annual. This is 1833. Now, again, there's this thing of, like, why am I looking at this? And so they give us some dialogue from the play. But what I want to draw your attention to, it would be injustice to the painter and a profanation to the poet to attempt to illustrate this picture. The only illustration is the following extract from Shakespeare. Meaning, the words are illustrating the picture. And in fact, for decades, the meaning of the word illustrate, it started being a text. It was like a commentary on a biblical passage. Or so illustrate then from like, I don't know, 1820 to 1850, sort of. It's a little, fluid. To say that something was an illustration could have been a written piece or a picture. It's not really until the demand is such and the idea of illustrating fiction, we saw a little bit of that with Scott. Illustrated fiction becomes a fashion. And then, now there's a reason to start hiring somebody to make a picture based on the story. As opposed to, I need 3 or 4 engravings for this issue. What do you got? And then how do I explain them? So there's that. And then pictorial images, optical images, become basic. He's having a bad day. Plural. Okay, this is an interesting idea. Okay, art masterpieces, right? They're singular. There's only one Ghent altarpiece. There's one Mona Lisa, and their value is defined by their singularity. There is no other. There's another category called multiples. Now, multiples involve a matrix with a finite number of expressions of the matrix. That can be a mold for a cast in bronze, or it can be a printing plate that a certain number of images are struck, and then the plate is defaced, and there will be no more. Warhol's Marilyns are kind of in the same category. So, a multiple is more than one, but a finite set. It's like buying shares of stock. There are only so many shares of stock. The price goes up, it's worth more. The stock falls, it's worth less. But it's based on, so finite scarcity is where the value comes from. Illustration, published illustration, is not like either of those things. It's plural in the sense of innumerable. It doesn't matter how many there are. I mean, if something is a hit and they print a gazillion copies of it, say, I don't know, the first edition of Baum's Wizard of Oz, illustrated by Denflo. That book sold like crazy. But like they would get paid more because of copyright, not because like, it's not like the value of the property was diluted by there being a lot of copies of it. It actually was increased. But they weren't paid by the print. They were paid by the edition or you know, there are various ways of doing that. But the point is, for the audience member, you can have the real thing for a very modest commercial price. And there's nothing about the thing that you have that is fake or not lesser. Make sense? So now there's a secondary market for illustration, and today, you know, you can find shepherd drawings from dealers, and you could pay money to have the original drawing. Okay, fine. But that's a secondary market. That doesn't have anything to do with how people read things. So, and in fact, when we use the term original to describe an illustration, which people do conventionally, you can make a very good argument that, no, that's not the original. That's the pre-artifact. The real thing is the edition publication, the printed publication. Yeah, these are really lovely drawings. Private. Now, I've gone back and forth on this idea of whether the right word is private or personal. But I'm leaning toward private in the sense that a reading experience, when you think about what it's like to read a book, it's like having somebody looking over your shoulder is not welcome. And in the history of reading, private silent reading actually wasn't a thing. It wasn't always like that. Reading was designed to reproduce speech, not so you could read it quietly. Also, the experience of reading to a child. Or an elder, for that matter. And even in public settings, like reading on a subway car, it's still, there's a little bit of an enclosure of space around you, which enables it to feel private. The other thing about this, and I haven't written about this yet, but you know when if you go to a library and get a book, or you, I don't know, you pick up a book somewhere, and you read it, nobody really knows what you're reading. If you read it on a website, somebody knows what you're reading. Even if you get a Kindle, Kindle knows what you're reading. So there is something about the I think privacy has a new and different value in the online world. Portable. Okay. This seems kind of dumb at first blush, but it's kind of important. There are lots of experiences which are integrated into architecture. Churches, temples, government buildings, where the sheer mass of the thing and the space, that experience is not private. It's decidedly not private. And it's designed to show the power of the institution. So, because I can't fold it up and tuck it in my bag, it's not really mine. It acts upon me. There's not really any choice for me. Even really big, sort of the exception to this rule would be like giant books, the reference books in libraries, like the atlas that's this big, which you're probably not going to stick with that. Murals. Periodical. This is not really a strict test, but so much of fiction was, and still is, published in a serial fashion that the overlap between magazine publishing and book publishing is like, generally, publishers are in both of those businesses and they're using one to feed the other. But a lot of illustration was produced. Sort of the high season of illustration, I think we can argue, is like 1870 to 1970, where there was tons and tons of illustrated matter for adults. And really it wasn't until television kind of knocked the legs out from under magazine publishing and the advertising revenue that changed. How many of you know that Charles Dickens' first illustrator committed suicide? The Pickwick Papers was a publishing project, and it was in that fluid moment where is it the artist thing and somebody writes that goes with the artist, or is it a written thing and an artist makes some doodads? And Chapman and Hall, the publisher of the Pickwick Papers, independently talked to Robert Seymour, who was a moderately successful caricaturist, and Dickens, and they both thought they were running the project. And then they meet at a certain point, and Dickens, who's like 24, but the force of Dickens' personality overwhelms Seymour. And there's a moment, so there's difficulty about that, and then there's a moment in which Dickens is like, yeah, okay, these two are okay, but you gotta redo these other two. They're just not good enough. And he goes home, tries to make it work. He's making etchings. He leaves the plate in the acid too long. It ruins the whole thing. He's got to start over. He's so agitated and admittedly a complicated, difficult person. Goes to bed, wakes up in the morning, walks out into the garden, and fires a shotgun blast into his chest. Oh. End of story. So I make the argument in the book that that's the moment where the writer takes over. Uncle Tom's Cabin, a hugely significant piece of visual culture as well as textual. And by and large, the visual expressions of Uncle Tom's Cabin overwhelmed, undermined, and wiped out Stowe's novel. It became a kind of racial set piece. Okay, I'm almost done, but I'm running out of time here. Position. If you're standing up to look at a picture, it's probably not an illustration. If you're sitting down, it's probably an illustration. There are exceptions. If I'm a Parisian pedestrian in the 1890s, I'm seeing these big things on the new boulevards of Paris. I'm moving through space on foot. These advertising posters by Gericke and others, and also billboards. That may be one of the most efficient pieces of visual communications ever. If Venturi's Learning from Las Vegas, which is about modern and postmodern architecture, they talk a lot about the signage of the casinos. So, that's our set. Now, this is going to fail for a variety of reasons. It's not printed, it's not portable. Obviously, there's no reading experience in the modern sense. Again, we could argue that, but so coming back to this basic thesis, there's in the 21st century, well, I haven't mentioned the idea of the codex. The codex is the folded paper, whether it's a newspaper or a fat book. The codex is basically a 3rd century invention, and it replaced the scroll, which was kind of a pain and difficult to find where you were. So people stopped using scrolls, but of course the scroll is back with a vengeance electronically on computers and you know, when you think about something you read in a book, it is highly likely that when you remember it, you remember where it was on the spread and about how far through the stack it was. When you go looking for it, you have some spatial reference. When you read on your phone or your computer, 0. There is no spatial or physical dimension to that. So there's all sorts of speculative stuff that it would be interesting to think about. I don't think I'm going to be the person who writes that book. But I don't want to think that hard about contemporary experience. Anyway, that's what I have for you today. Thank you. Wow.